The Center for Critical Thinking and Moral Critique, in concert with Sonoma State University, is proud to present videotape proceedings of the International Conference on Critical Thinking and Educational Reform.
Thank you. This session is, I think, the 8th in the series, and I've been trying to build a line of thought through the series, and as a result, there will be things that lead into this that I will not be covering in this session, and so you may very well have questions that you need to get answered either by watching the earlier programs or by talking to me or writing to me. I have begun each of the programs with this distinction. It's a distinction between what I call three logics. One is the logic of reasoning in general. That is, what are the parts of reasoning? How does reasoning work? What is reasoning? And I've made the point throughout that if teachers do not understand what reasoning is, then their attempt to get students to reason and reason well is going to be flawed. And most teachers do not understand what reasoning is. And so this is a very fundamental problem, as I see it from my perspective, in fostering reasoning in the classroom. Now, there's a second logic which is essential to this triad as I see it, and that's the logic of the content. To teach any content presupposes that not necessarily that you've mastered the logic of that content, but that you can reason within the logic of that content. And notice that I'm assuming something here, and that is that content has a logic. So let me comment briefly on what that means. First of all, content as we know it is not a natural phenomenon. You won't find content in the field. You won't find content like leaves on a tree. Content is something produced only by minds. Minds produce content, what we call content. Content is found in books, and books are constructed out of language and ideas. They're not a natural phenomenon. And content has a special relationship to reasoning. Content is discovered by the reasoning mind, conceptualized and constructed by the reasoning mind, taken apart by the reasoning mind, comprehended by the reasoning mind, applied by the reasoning mind, organized by the reasoning mind, synthesized and evaluated by the reasoning mind. Take the reasoning mind out of content and it doesn't exist. Content is not something separate from thinking. It is totally, completely, 100% dependent on thinking. Now, why do I emphasize what should be obvious to everyone And that is, very often you hear a colossal misconception expressed. It's extremely common. It's this: I can't find additional time to foster thinking because I have to get the students to learn this content. And underneath this is the blatant assumption that somehow you can learn content without thinking. That thinking is not an integral part of, indeed a defining part of what content is. Now, there is a trivial sense in which content can be brought into the mind separate from thinking, and the sense in which content can be brought onto a tape of a tape recorder without the tape recorder's thinking. Namely, by simply rotely recalling the words and being able to express those words back. But tape recorders do not erase themselves, but rotely memorized content soon disappears, and there are any number of empirical studies that demonstrated it. Therefore, even if there was a reason to get the students to record it for later reflection, even that cannot take place with the mind unless the mind comprehends what it is taking in. And I've developed that point, and it can be shown in detail, and the empirical studies are there. And it's tremendously important because again and again, when I talk to teachers and professors, they present this false dilemma, which reveals the lack of their understanding of the logic of their own content. You might notice that the same mistake was made in Bloom's taxonomy, in which presumably first the student learns knowledge, then they comprehend it. Now think about that. They know something which they do not comprehend. This is unintelligible. The first level of Bloom's taxonomy is recall. It is not knowledge. Recall, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, evaluation. Knowledge presupposes evaluation. Knowledge is information known, assessed to be true. And therefore, knowledge presupposes evaluation. And therefore, you can't get knowledge before evaluation. Knowledge is parasitic upon evaluation. So it's a colossal mistake in Bloom's taxonomy, and it has thrown off teachers all over the country again and again and again, who are led to believe that they're giving students knowledge, when all they're doing is getting them to memorize and store in their short-term memory a certain amount of content. There's the third of this triad, extremely important, and that is the logic of the student's thinking. And again, why the logic of? Because thinking is a system-structured phenomenon. One cannot ultimately think in monads, in atomic bits and pieces unrelated to each other. Wherever thinking exists, it organizes itself in some way. And in order for the mind, as it organizes a system to cope with reality and make sense of things, in order for any mind to understand anything new, it has to understand this new thing on its own terms. The new thing has got to fit into its system. It cannot dump a system out, as you might do a program on your computer, and dump in new software. What the mind has to do is change its own software as it uses that software. And this presents a major problem in the classroom, and teachers and professors need to interest themselves in the logic of their students' thinking, precisely because this is the only logic that the students can use to reason about the logic of the content. And so these three in class need to converge. We need students to begin to understand the logic of reasoning so that they can organize the logic of their own thinking in a more rational fashion, thereby making it increasingly possible for them to learn the logic of the content, which is inevitably a highly disciplined thing. And that's why we call enterprises that systematically study and attempt to construct and explicate the logic of any given content. This is why we call them a discipline, because the logic of the content is disciplined by people who have shaped this content through the disciplined process of the reasoning mind as it critically assesses itself and attempts to come to truth amidst all the dangers and pitfalls of the human mind, which is not in itself naturally inclined to the truth. And so this is part of the background of today's session on why intellectual standards, why teach for them. Let me relate that very specifically and in broad strokes to this overhead diagram, and then we'll get into some details, including a brief attempt on my part to show you where intellectual standards come from. Because it's extremely important in this age of radical subjectivity to have some sense that intellectual standards are not being cooked up by some group arbitrarily. There was one review of my book, which was published in a social studies journal, that said the standards were white, male, Eurocentric standards dreamed up by philosophers. And then, quite interestingly, the review proceeded to use those standards to critique my work. And this is one point about the intellectual standards that I talk about. You can't not use them. You have no choice. You can't say, well, for our group, we don't care about clarity, precision, accuracy, consistency. We're not interested in verification. We're not trying to be deep. We're satisfied with being superficial. We don't need to be broad. We're happy to be narrow. And we don't concern ourselves with relevance. These are the standards that are the common possession of all the disciplines, and there's nothing white about them, nothing male about them, nothing that designates a particular culture or race of people. Science everywhere uses them. It doesn't matter what your gender is, what your race is. You have to be concerned with accuracy, with clarity, with precision, with the implications of the data, and so forth and so on. And only a person whose education was not founded on a clear understanding of these standards could possibly think that the standards have something to do with the gender of the person or something to do with their national or racial background. Okay, in general, this is how I see the relationship here with respect to standards. First of all, a distinction, criteria and standards. We start with criteria. The standards is the level of performance that we expect on those criteria. So we want clarity always. But how much clarity and the form of clarity becomes the standard that we set along using the criteria clarity. We want accuracy always. But how much accuracy is relevant to this context, to this problem? We set a standard appropriate to the problem, but we always have to use the criterion of accuracy. So we have the criteria. These are intellectual criteria. Then we set a standard on them in each domain, and we often modify it in the domain in accordance with the logic of the question or our practical circumstances, as the case may be. In other words, accurate enough for these purposes, relevant enough given this, and so forth. So there are criteria and standards. Now, if we take reasoning, there are standards for reasoning inherent in the very nature of what reasoning is. Reasoning is the attempt to figure something out. It cannot be, therefore, to figure it out unclearly. It cannot be to figure it out inaccurately. It cannot be to figure it out irrelevantly. That doesn't make sense. It is conceptually incoherent. To figure something out, to set yourself that task, is to set yourself, by implication, onto the task of figuring it out clearly, relevantly, completely if the purpose requires it, deeply if the purpose requires it. And if the thing to be figured out requires examination from more than one point of view, then you have to look at more than one point of view, and you figure it out broadly in a more encompassing framework with multiple approaches precisely because the task requires it. There's nothing male about this. This is just the logic of the concept of figuring something out. The concept of figuring something out becomes unintelligible if you say, well, we figure it out unclearly, inaccurately, imprecisely. It doesn't make sense. It loses all of its meaning. The very concept of reasoning collapses into nothing. And by the way, now let me step away from this and suggest, where are these standards coming from? Ultimately, where do they come from? There are three sources, and they're all interconnected with each other. They don't stand separate. The first is the logic of language. And I just want to say a couple of things about it. I'm not going to be able to develop this at length. I've written on the subject, and it's a very important thing to understand. That is, part of the standards come right out of the meanings of the words and the nature of the concepts that underlie the words. I just illustrated that using the concept of figuring out. In order to figure out something, you have to state what it is that you want to figure out. That is, you have to choose language which says clearly what you're trying to figure out. And that requires that words have some meaning that is not arbitrary. And so when I say, I want to figure this out, an educated speaker of the English language knows that implies figure it out accurately. I don't have to say figure it out accurately. It is implied in the meaning of the word figure out. And every word carries with it standards, criteria and standards appropriate to its proper use. If I call you cunning when you're simply clever, then I've misused the word cunning. There's something I don't understand about it. Cunning implies more than clever to an educated speaker. Those are not synonyms. If you have the courage of your convictions, that is, if your behavior matches the logic of what those words imply, and I call you pig-headed, then I don't understand the difference between what is implied in saying somebody is pig-headed and what is being implied when somebody says that the person lacks the courage of their convictions. There is a difference in the logic of having judgment and being judgmental, for example. It's not good to be judgmental, it's good to have judgment. The words have a different logic. Now, once you start playing fast and loose with words and let them slip and slide all over, all reasoning goes out the window, all is lost. It's a standard. Now, of course, the logic of words can change, but it has to change for a good reason. And you have to use the logic of words, keeping most of them unchanging, while you make a case for changing some part of it. And so, the logic of the language we speak, and when I say the logic of the language, I mean as used by educated speakers, those who understand the history of established use. Any speaker of the language can misuse a portion of the language simply because they don't know how that word is used. I remember on one of the series in All of the Family, Archie Bunker says, yeah, those Catholics, I can't stand the way they spread incest all around at their services. Okay, well, you know, we laugh at it because we know the logic of the word incest. And he's confusing it with the logic of the word incense. So, and when a student carelessly uses words that need to be distinguished from each other because they have precisely different implications, socialization does not have the same implications as the word training. Training does not have the same implications as the word indoctrination. And indoctrination does not have the same implications as the word education. We should not throw these words around. Are we trainers? Are we socializers? Are we indoctrinators? Are we educators? Don't say it doesn't make any difference. It's only semantics. A world of difference comes in the implications that follow these different words, and if you don't think clearly about their use and you don't restrain your mind in the light of that use, then you can't think clearly, at least not in the English language, perhaps in some other language. And so the logic of language is part of it. Now, let me step back from this and bring another part, sort of tie this in with something I've mentioned before. When I was talking about the logic of content, I said discipline. Now, discipline is unintelligible unless there's something that disciplines, something to which you must conform yourself. And so high jumping requires and involves discipline because there's a standard that is set up that you must conform your jumping to. If we just had people, I could imagine a Monty Python skit where you had jumping, but no jumping standard. So people jumped in different ways, in different directions, and then they argued about who won. You can't do it that way. You've got to have a standard for high jump. Ballet has standards. Tap dancing has standards. Tennis has standards. Baseball has standards. And that's how we can assess the performance. No standards, no assessment, nothing to conform yourself to. All right, language is something the logic of language we must conform ourselves to on pain of non-communication and on pain of confusion. There is no such thing as having your own private language. You wouldn't yourself understand what it meant if it was something that you're cooking up all by yourself, because what terms would you use to define the terms that you're defining? And of course, there are many other implications, such as dictionaries would be impossible and so forth. The second is, very closely related, the logic of questions. If you ask this question, legally, is my client guilty? You are constrained by a different logic than if you say, morally, is their behavior to be disapproved of? And it's a different question because of the logic of the differing words. And therefore, in order to assess reasoning, we have to find out what is the question at issue, because you must, as a reasoner, conform yourself to the logic of that question. If it's a legal question, the appropriate standards come from the law. If it's a moral question, the appropriate standards come from the principles of morality in keeping with good reasoning and so forth. So the logic of questions do not stand alone. They presuppose the logic of reasoning in general, and they target that logic onto a specific domain, either the law, moral principles, economics, personal preference, or some other domain. Now, students routinely confuse questions of fact, questions of reason, judgment, and questions of opinion or taste. Questions of opinion or pure taste, that is, questions of mere taste, questions of mere opinion, have no place in education whatsoever. We should never be asking students, what's their opinion, when we mean mere opinion. We shouldn't assign essays on which is better, chocolate or butterscotch pudding. Which is better, Chinese or Russian cooking. Which is better, to vacation in the seashore or in the mountains? Those questions have the logic of opinion and taste purely, and the ancient Romans had a saying about this, de gustibus non est disputandum. Concerning matters of taste, there can be no intelligible discussion. Don't dispute it. You're wasting your time. And of course, only children or uneducated adults argue up and back, this is better, that's better, I like this, you like that. If it's just a matter of preference, only you know what you prefer, and I cannot prove that you do not prefer what you ought to prefer if it's a matter of pure taste. However, there is also the category of questions that call for reasoned judgment. So if you took the question, which is better, Russian cooking or Chinese cooking, for reasons of nutrition, now the question has a logic. It may have the logic of fact, or it may have the logic of reasoned judgment. I'm not sure. I'd have to know more about the logic of nutrition to know whether that's a question of fact or a question of reasoned judgment. A question of fact has a right and a wrong answer. A question of reasoned judgment has a better and a worse answer. A question of mere taste has as many answers as there are people who have different tastes. And somebody who understands the logic of questions does not confuse these questions, but they're routinely confused in the classroom continually. Students then end up thinking there are only two kinds of questions, questions of fact and questions of opinion. And they learn that all opinions are as good as each other, and therefore they decide that their opinion is as good as Einstein's or as good as so-and-so, and they say, who's to say? Well, if it's a matter of taste, everyone's to say. You're to say what you prefer, you're to say what you prefer, you're to say what you prefer. When it's a question of fact, it isn't up to anyone to say. It's up to everyone to verify. That's the task. Not to say, but to check. And if it's a matter of reasoned judgment, it's not a question of who's to say, it's what's the reasoning. And so if the question in court is the accused guilty of negligence, then we don't say, well, jury, what do you say? We say, reason it through. Make sure you consider only the evidence. Let's make sure you don't come in here with a pre-decision one way or the other. Make sure you don't judge the law, because the law, it's not a question, is the law of negligence the right law of negligence? That's irrelevant to the question. You should not consider it. It's a matter of law. You get instructions from the judge as to the proper things to take into account, and presumably the jury reasons together, because the question is a matter of reasoned judgment. It's not a matter of who's to say. It's not a matter of opinion. And so these are very fundamental things, but the students are completely at sea, and unfortunately most of their teachers are with them. It's a classic case of the blind leading the blind. Intellectual standards are not present in the classroom in any visible way. And if you're in the classroom and you're observing instruction and you understand these things, then you feel misinstruction is occurring in a rampant fashion. Ellen Schoenfeld, understanding the logic of mathematics, understanding the logic of mathematical reasoning, therefore, says math instruction today has two characteristics. One, it is deceptive, and two, it is fraudulent. Why? Because what is going on in the math class, by and large, is not mathematical reasoning. It's plugging things mindlessly into formulas, and when you're doing that, he says, you're not doing math. In other words, he's saying that math instruction is being taught by people who don't understand math and what it is to do math, because once you get to the formula, once you know what the formula is and what to plug it in, the math is over with. There's just calculations left. The mathematical reasoning comes in choosing the formula, understanding the formula, and appropriately using math strategies to do this. Now, whether he's right or wrong about the logic of mathematics, I cannot say. I'm not a mathematician, but I understand the general logic of his reasoning. And if he's right, what is going on in the math classes is very parallel to what is going on in the history class, where students are not learning to reason historically, and that's not a matter of possibility. I do understand something about the logic of historical reasoning, and students don't do any of it. Very often not even when they're history majors at a college. It keeps getting delayed. You'll get that in your methodology course, and then you'll get that in graduate school. Wait until you do your dissertation, then you'll do it. And then, of course, you've got a committee, and their reasoning, or that is, their conclusions, to make sure you don't dispute if you want to get licensed as a PhD. All right, now what is the third foundation? It's the foundation which is necessary to give these first two building blocks, basic building blocks for standards, some ultimate solidity. And I'm going to use a word that's going to sound metaphysical, but I don't intend it in a metaphysical way. The logic of reality. Now, let me explain as soon as possible why I don't mean that in a metaphysical way. If a chemist asks this question, what is the boiling point of sodium hydroxide under standard temperature and pressure? All right. She answers that question by consulting the logic of reality. She takes the stuff, she controls the condition, she puts the thermometer into the beaker, she heats it up, she measures it. It's how sodium hydroxide behaves under those circumstances that she's interested in. That's embedded in sodium hydroxide. It is not embedded in the mind of the chemist. Chemistry is interested in the real logic of chemicals. Now, you could compare that to astrology that is not interested in the real logic of human behavior. It's interested in creating a system that convinces us that we understand that logic without having to do any verification. And of course, it's oh so pleasant to see what Capricorns will be thinking today and what's going to happen by reading it in the newspaper and so forth. But this, of course, is not accepted by the scientific community because they are not convinced, and of course they could make a mistake, I suspect not, that astrologers are not really interested in the logic of reality. They're interested in the logic of their system and maintaining that logic. And in fact, one of the major problems in human thinking is, do you accommodate your thinking to reality, or do you accommodate reality to your thinking? And this is the ultimate question for a critical thinker. If reality isn't what you're trying to conform your thinking to, you can be intelligent, you can be witty, you can be articulate, but your thinking will be deeply flawed. And this is very easy because in every system of belief, there are three kinds of believers. There are those who are in tune with what I'm talking about. I would call them critical believers. Critical Christians, critical mathematicians, critical sociologists, critical Americans, critical jurists, critical this, critical that. These are people who understand that there is a logic that they must conform their thinking to. They can make a mistake. The system can make a mistake. It needs to be correctable. It needs to be falsifiable. It needs to be something that can be changed in virtue of the meeting of that system with the logic of reality through human reason. But then, There are sophistic believers and there are vulgar believers. Vulgar believers are those who really don't understand the logic of the content, that is, they don't understand the logic of the ideology. And if, for example, they happened to be a Marxist, they would talk like this: down with the capitalist pigs, smash the state, power to the people. They don't understand, they haven't read Marx, they don't understand the intricacies of his thought, they don't see the problems inherent in the questions that he raised. They don't understand the logic of the content. They've picked up some images, some metaphors, and they've been evangelized in their true believers, and they're marching, and they're ready to fight and die for the cause, which they don't understand. But they don't know they don't understand it. And then there are the sophistic believers. The sophistic believers are intelligent, perceptive, often scholarly in their own way. But here's the test. Where is the system that you believe in most flawed, most weak, and what insights do you see in other systems that your system has not incorporated? And their answer is none. I see none. And that's it. They see none but their system. And so they can write 6 volumes of very closely reasoned but narrow-minded thinking, which never seriously entertains another system, never empathically enters into the thinking of the critics of the system they hold, always trying to understand the system outside their system in order to negate it and defend their own system. What in the religion that I was raised in was called apologetics. And I think that's the right word. You ought to apologize for it. Because what you're doing is trying to show why you're right and everyone else is wrong all the time. Okay, well, if you get the spirit of it, what this means is what we're talking about in the critical thinking movement is helping our students as far as possible not to be sophistic believers, not to be vulgar believers, but to recognize the true challenge that the mind faces when it tries to understand reality, non-metaphysical again. I don't say absolute. I don't know anything about absolute reality. I don't understand that expression. It doesn't have a clear logic in my mind. And so if I said, I've got a mosquito bite, and you said, is that an absolute truth? I wouldn't know what you meant by it. I'd say, well, I've got a mosquito bite. You tell me, is that an absolute truth? Is a mosquito bite part of absolute reality? Do you see? Doesn't make any sense to me. I don't get it. I've never understood metaphysics. I remember from the importance of being earnest. One character says, Ernest is saying, well, what if my name wasn't Ernest? Couldn't you still love me? And the character says, that is a metaphysical question. And as we all know, metaphysical questions have very little to do with reality as we know it. And then the conversation goes on. And I thought Oscar Wilde really hit the nail on the head for metaphysics. Very little to do with reality as we know it. And so I'm not talking about something metaphysical here, but something very mundane. And all of this means that when we say there's a discipline to reasoning, we're not cooking up something from a gender-based standpoint. And let me add one further thing here, because some people may think of this. Language is not to be equated with culture. This is another fundamental mistake. The English language is not, to think in the English language is not to be British. It's not to be New Zealand. It's not to be Australian. It's not to be American. It's not to be anything else. Now, it's true that languages are used by cultures, but people in other cultures can learn other languages without knowing diddly about the other culture. And when a Frenchman learns English and becomes a fluent speaker of English, he doesn't become an American. Lo and behold. He can still think like a Frenchman, and he can think like a Frenchman in English. Sometimes he has a little trouble translating some of his French thoughts into English, but not a lot of them. And as he develops more proficiency in the second language, the more he can just shift gears. It's more like the difference between, no, I'm not going to use that metaphor. Okay, so the point is that in culture we indoctrinate, we socialize, and we socialize people into a belief system. And so when you live in a culture, you learn to believe certain things, to see things in a certain way, and to believe that reality is thus and so. Now, if you say, what does the English language think is the proper way to parent? Doesn't make any sense. The English language has no opinion on the subject. American culture does. Yes, and you see that where? Not in language. You see it in Hollywood movies, on the soaps, on the talk shows. As the people talk, that's culture. But the Oxford English Dictionary, in all 26 volumes, is not expressing anything British, and so forth. Now, I say that as a generality. You will find some words that are loaded and need to be deloaded, and we're working on that. But this is, let me take a guess, 200 words out of 600,000. Which is the number of words in the English language. Tremendous number of words in the language. Some of them got mucked up, need to be thought about. In any case, you can think about any word in this way. All right, now if this is true, this general model is true, then how are we going to bring this in the classroom, and why is it important? If students do not begin to see themselves as being under restraints when they think, if they don't see the content as having a logic, that is something they can reason through, if they don't see their thinking as something they want to conform to something beyond itself, then they're not going to master any content. They're not going to become reasoned thinkers, and education is not going to take place. Because education is based on reasoning and the attempt to know as best you can, and developing skills as a knower. Not skills as a believer, because, do you see, believing is not a skill. Knowing is a skill. Anyone can believe. You don't need to be trained to do that. And so what we're not trying to do is give students beliefs. We're trying to give them skills. They're skills that enable you to construct rational beliefs. And the rational beliefs are found by studying rational content, sociology, biology, physics, chemistry, economics, anthropology, on and on it goes. All the disciplines, and also all those questions that the disciplines are not raising. Because remember, the disciplines are a historical product. They don't exist as, God never came down and said, let there be anthropology, let there be chemistry. It's humans who are constructing these, and there's a whole lot we haven't yet constructed. And there are many, many questions you can ask that don't fit into any discipline. And education is concerned to develop the mind and the skills that are connected with the mind and all that is connected with that. And that means that there'll be a lot of questions that are unanswered, a lot of ignorance in the disciplines. And in fact, to really understand the logic of some content is to understand the logic of how much is not known. And it's only people who superficially understand the logic of content that are impressed with how much is known. The more you know you don't know, and it takes reasoning and precise use of language to see that. So, this is the basic model that we're concerned with, and we want to bring it into the classroom. It's truly a challenge. It is not something, I hope you can see, that's going to happen overnight, because it represents a paradigm shift. Clarity, precision, accuracy, depth, breadth, relevance, significance. Understanding the importance of these criteria and the various standards you can set in various areas by means of them is a lifetime endeavor. You can understand them in a rough and ready way through any decent dictionary. And I strongly recommend that you look up words like this in the dictionary and pay close attention to their logic. For example, there's a difference between the logic of precision and the logic of accuracy. Because though you cannot be accurate without some degree of precision, you can be absolutely precise and totally wrong, inaccurate. Simple case. This pen weighs 2.53478 tons. It's very precise, is it not? And very inaccurate. So precision and accuracy are not the same thing. And we have to understand the logic of their interrelationships in order to reason. Now notice, if you want to impress people, give them precise statistics. They will assume they're accurate because they don't understand. Precision and accuracy are not the same thing. You can be perfectly precise and absolutely inaccurate, but people will assume that if you're that precise, you must be accurate. Okay, so start with the dictionary yourself. Do your own thinking about these words because, you see, again, the logic of learning is the logic of somebody's thinking. And they have their own thinking that they must work through. Here, I am thinking aloud in front of you and giving you the logic of my thinking, but you are critical listeners, and you're trying to take my words and translate those words into the logic of your thinking. And if I'm good at the logic of speaking, then I give you lots of examples that tie into your experience and therefore into your thinking, because your thinking is grounded in your experience. And what I say makes as much sense to you as I can make it make using words and being a communicator. But ultimately, you have to work it out in your mind, and I can't work it out for you. For example, some of this may seem confusing. Well, it should be confusing a bit if it's new to you, because it's getting at some very basic stuff and in terms of a paradigm shift. And so, of course, you have to work it through. It's not going to immediately, all your questions are certainly not going to be answered. You will have many questions. Notice this about the logic of teaching. Does this sound familiar to you? Any questions now? No? Good, then we can go on. This is a failure to understand the logic of teaching. Here's the appropriate question. Any questions now? No? Then I've totally misexplained it. Because you should have many, many questions. No questions means you didn't understand it. Because if you understood it, you'd see all the unanswered questions. And so the logic of thinking is the logic of your thinking ultimately, and you've got to work that out for yourself, and so do your students. So we must bring these standards into the classroom, but we cannot just impose them on the student in a kind of dictatorial way without helping them to reason through these standards and to see why. So we might have to say, why should we be concerned with accurately recording the data when we do this experiment? Why does that matter? Can anyone tell me why? And maybe you play the devil's advocate here for a little bit, in order to encourage the students to think it through on their own and to see the significance of it. Well, let's suppose we didn't record it accurately. What would some implications and consequences be as you see it? What do you think, Sharon? What do you think, Jack? And so forth. We have to bring the standards, the criteria in a way that helps the students increasingly to weave that into their thinking. They'll keep, like a rubber band, going back to their original shape. You'll give them a little, their thinking will move them out, the class will end, the rubber band will go back. You stretch them again with thinking, and the rubber band goes back. But unlike rubber bands, then the mind starts to stretch a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, and doesn't go back as far as it did before. But one has to be extremely patient here. because minds change only in an evolutionary way, only gradual. And it's only when enough new things have come in and been assimilated that the system re-gestalts itself or recrystallizes. And so somebody who is deeply into the old paradigm will be bothered and uneasy about what I'm saying, and even if they rhetorically accept it, deep in the recesses of their mind, the old system of give them knowledge, test them to see if they have knowledge. A little bit of reasoning, yeah, that's not so bad, but you can't bit too much because you got to get this content covered and so forth. Not a lot of time for a lot of questions because we have to go on and so forth and so on. All of those assumptions will still be in their practice because in their own mind, in their own thinking, deeply, that's what they believe in. And as long as they believe in it, they've got to teach that way. They have no choice. And I'm not saying that any system, any department, should impose this on any faculty anywhere. Because if they don't see it, if they haven't reasoned it through, it's of no use to them. I don't want critical thinking taught by people who don't think critically. They'll just muck it up. They'll give it a bad rap. Students will say, yeah, critical thinking is somebody telling you what to think, which, of course, misses the whole thing. Or critical thinking is manipulating you into the belief sense of into the beliefs of the teacher, but indirectly, not straightforwardly, by all kinds of covert little nudges and so forth. So you end up thinking like the instructor, watch out, it's tricky. That's not what critical thinking is. But try this out with your colleagues. Ask them this question: what intellectual standards do you teach your students to use when mastering the content that is the subject of your instruction? What are the intellectual standards? And you'll find two responses. One, I don't know what you mean. And you'll find it's sort of, you have to go over a mini lecture on this subject before it begins to get intelligible. Or number two, well, of course I do that. We all do that. It's part and parcel of the discipline. You know, if you're a biologist, of course, that's the way you think. And so, therefore, it's in every nook and cranny of my class. I don't even have to mention it. It's just always there, which is self-delusion. And you can see that very readily by simply talking to the students and paying attention to their work, and you'll see the intellectual standards are not there. There is one intellectual standard, and it's not an intellectual standard in the best sense of the term, that the students use and consider fair. It's this: accuracy of recall. I accurately said what you said. I accurately said what the text said. I should get an A. What else do you want me to do? I said what you wanted me to say. That's my job. Tape recorder number 10657, reporting, sir. It's a big challenge, but we need intellectual standards. We need them in the classroom as soon as possible. We need to articulate them, talk about them, link them to reasoning, link them to language, link them to content, and work out the details in every area, at every level. Thank you very much.